The Bank of Canada governor did give sort of an end-of-year address and a summary. And Heather, he talked about the need to listen better for the bank, to communicate better for the bank. What do you take away about what Tiff Macklem is saying to the country at the end of 2022?
Well, I think he's saying we've had a heck of a year. I mean, if you go back a year ago now, we were all of a sudden hit by Omicron, which hurt us a lot. And then we had the invasion of Ukraine. And prices, inflation went, they thought they could get it under control using traditional methods, and they clearly haven't. And so he was a little bit, he was quite reflective actually over what went wrong over the past year, and pointing out that we are kind of at a changing point right now, or soon will be, and what they're going to be looking forward in the future. And he really stressed that inflation really hurts everybody, and it's more important for him to really make sure inflation is under control right now by raising interest rates than it is there's a risk that he'll go overboard, right, and drive the economy into even more of a recession than what we suspect is about to hit us now. But he's certainly going to be leaning on the inflation side of that equation to make sure it's really under control.
Yeah, Peter, that was certainly one of the messages from Tiff Macklem today, and I think similar to what he said to you in that one-on-one interview you did with him a while ago, that there's a risk in overcorrecting and undercorrecting, but you got to make sure you get inflation under control, so they're going to err on the side of that.
Yeah, he was as clear, I think, as he's been yet to say that, yeah, there's a risk that if we overshoot and raise rates too high, we could cause more pain than necessary in a recession. But that if we undershoot it and think, hey, yeah, we got inflation under control and we can hit the pause button, and then it turns out 3 months from now we didn't have inflation under control, and you've got to take way more punitive action and raise rates even higher, that's a real risk for the economy too. And in today's speech in Vancouver, he made it very clear that right now, as things stands, that latter one is the greater risk. That risk of overshooting is the greater risk. And so, that's where we stand now. That said, as you well know, we're going to get GDP numbers next week. We're going to get inflation numbers next week. They're going to flush out that picture, and we'll see where that risk lies. But to end off his public appearances in this very weird year of 2022, the Bank of Canada governor is trying to make it clear that, look, we may not be done yet. And this notion that we're getting ready to hit the pause button at any second is going to still be very, very data dependent.
Yeah, Heather, I was struck that the written release on the 50 basis points rate increase sort of gave a wait and see impression. That's certainly what I took from reading it. But his comments today were, I don't know, not quite as definitive, that really we need to see the data. We got to figure out what's going on, and we are going to be so resolute in getting inflation back to 2% that I don't know if I was assured that maybe we're at peak rates based on what he said today.
Yeah, I think he probably meant to add a little bit of questioning into that, because he did repeat that he would be, it's going to be dependent on data, and that's what the release last week said as well. But I think for the governor, it's very, very important that people believe that that he will keep going until inflation is under control, right? It's that inflation expectations piece, which is so important to him. And so he's going to add a lot of uncertainty into there so that people don't start to think he's going to be complacent. I mean, a lot of it is playing with our heads and how to make us think. But he really can't afford, in his mind anyway, he can't afford to have anybody doubt the fact that he will crush inflation.
Yeah, Peter, one of the things he talked about today were some of the lessons that he learned, in particular that supply interruptions are more inflationary when the economy is overheated, that the impact is faster and larger and more pronounced than their models suggested when you have these supply shocks with this great post-Omicron reopening that we went through. And it's sort of like part of the explanation as to why a lot of people think the bank kind of got it wrong on inflation, a year or so ago when they were calling it transitory. What do you make of what he had to say?
He had a great line that, you don't get to 8% inflation when just one thing goes wrong. There's a bunch of things that lead to that. And I think you're right. I think part of that is an explanation for how it sort of misread the situation heading into this. But it's also a setup for where we're going in this next stage, right? We've had 2020, 2021 and parts of 2022 being really dominated by restrictions and by health concerns. And now as we're emerging into whatever this next phase is going to be, the economy is going to be reopening. We're going to be back to talking about trade deals and potential trade problems with trade deals. And where are the inflationary pressure is going to come from in this next phase, right? If you've got China reopening, if you've got, trade starting to flow a little bit better once supply chains have now started to sort themselves out, that we need to sort of take a more holistic approach. And it is interesting from him to hear him sort of take that stance about, we did learn a lot through this, and that inflation doesn't just come from one source. It really makes you feel like, boy, I'd love to sit down and actually get like an honest to goodness moment with this guy and be like, what do you think happened and what do you think is going to happen next? I think central bankers, especially this one, have to be so careful in what they say. That clip of Tiff Macklem saying rates are going to remain low for a really long time is going to haunt him through his tenure. And so he's going to be more careful in what he says and how he frames things. But it's one of those moments you'd really like to get, an honest assessment of what his gut tells him in this moment. Because the fact is, we don't really know what 2023 is going to look like.
You both have bigger economic brains than me, but Heather, one of the things that stuck out to me in his comments today was he kind of talked about how a lot of the de-inflationary pressures of the past 30 years, the specialized supply chains from low wage and quite frankly authoritarian countries like China, they're going to go away to some degree as we build like the friendshoring initiative that Chrystia Freeland's always talking about, and we're going to trade that efficiency for certainty, and that's going to bake inflation in a way that we haven't had to deal with for a couple of decades now.
Yeah, he's stressed, I think, that, anybody who's hankering for the good old days of, 2019, it's not coming back because the pandemic and the, everything that's happened since then have really changed and restructured the global economy in permanent ways. And so, whether it's friendshoring or whether it's just, companies who have been burnt too many times by these rolling crises that come at us, companies are restructuring their supply chains and the way we trade, and they're just becoming a lot more cautious. They're also heavily indebted in terms of governments and individuals. So there are all these things that stick with us from the pandemic, that kind of legacy, which mean that when the Bank of Canada goes to play around with its regular old tools to deal with inflation, I think the governor's indicating it's going to be a lot more difficult now, given all these forces and given that things will just become more expensive because we're dealing with resilience instead of efficiency. So he's going to be having a hard time when he comes to ratcheting that inflation rate down to 2%.
So, Peter, monetary policy and fiscal policy have tried to work together throughout the pandemic, certainly, and even in trying to cool things off a little bit, though there is some criticism of how the feds are ramping things back. But this sort of industrial policy and trade policy of bringing things into the higher wage democracies to make it more stable, I mean, that potentially, not quite tension, but a little bit of conflict between what the government does and what the bank is trying to do, correct?
I mean, look, I think it'll be really interesting to see if any of this pans out. Like I say, I don't think we have a sense right now of what the global economy is going to look like this time next year, let alone this, next summer. There is so much in flux, more in flux than frankly I can remember in my adult life, that there are a lot of moving parts here. And the Chinese economy is doing certain things. The Russian economy is obviously doing different things. The European economy is trying to shore up its relationship with North America. A lot of those tensions, think back to, how many times did I come on this show and talk to you, David, about, the trade relationship between Canada and the United States and the problems that we had there leading up to the NAFTA renegotiations. Like there is so much that has changed in a really short period of time, and it feels like the pandemic has kind of hit the pause button on all of them. And things changed while we had the pause button hit, and now we need to figure out where everything's at. So I do think there is tension there between what the sort of general direction of the federal government wants to be in terms of that friendshoring and what its industrial policy will look like going forward, and what the Bank of Canada sees as happening in general trends. But I think the main thing we got to figure out is how are all of those forces going to come to play in the next 6 months, 12 months, maybe even 18 months, because I think there's a lot of pent-up activity that's waiting to be unleashed now that, a lot of those restrictions, especially in China, but around the world, have started to lift.
Who knew we might be nostalgic for the chaos of the NAFTA talks? Heather, just one last point. I mean, do you think Tiff Macklem is going to be as much of a main character in 2023 as he was in 2022, or do you think the Bank of Canada can step back a bit from the spotlight and the scrutiny?
Oh, I don't think they're ready to step back yet. I mean, we have to, if we're heading into a recession, they will certainly be playing a central role there too. And it's very uncertain right now about which way rates, is he on pause? Is he going to raise them a little bit more? If we fall into a recession, will it require him to start cutting rates again? So I think we're still quite a few months away from being able to safely ignore the Bank of Canada like we used to.
Yeah. Peter, what do you think? Do you think Tiff Macklem's still front and center for 2023?
Very much so. And in a weird way, I think 2023 is going to be kind of like a mirror image of 2022, where we had a really strong beginning in 2022 and then a really weak second half. We're going to see a really weak beginning to the year and then a fairly strong second half. And those transitions are always tricky for monetary policy. They're tricky for federal fiscal policy as well. But they're super tricky for what are you going to do about interest rates? And how do you signal? That last question to Tiff Macklem in the news conference that we heard was about, is he willing to telegraph what that pause might look like when he gets there? And he was like, look, I'm not even going to get into what it might look like until we're actually there, and we're not there yet. So, I think the next step on the calendar is January 26th, and we'll see if he has actually paused. But yeah, I think Tiff Macklem's going to be a very central character in the drama that is Canadian economics and politics for the next year at least.
All right. Well, you're two dramatic characters in that, too. So I also appreciate you both coming on tonight. Thanks to Peter Armstrong, CBC Senior Business Correspondent, and Heather Scoffield, Ottawa Bureau Chief with the Toronto Star. Thanks, gang.
Thanks.